A new season brought forth by a new year. What new dangers, what new knowledges, what discoveries, and what stories will we uncover? For all of these and more can be found here at the Lair of OmnusI in this, our third season. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, friends and one and all. I am OmnusI, here with you for a special video. I have been perusing social media, and while that is often a black cesspool of despair and disappointment, a few questions keep popping up that I think could be addressed. And one of the biggest ones is, how do I start? How do I, as a, say, first-time game master, how do I start this whole thing? And quite honestly, it's a challenging answer because, well, it's fairly nuanced. Everybody has their own personal experience, and every game master will eventually have their own style, so my style and technique may not work for everybody. I certainly wouldn't recommend that just everybody use the same methods I use, because that could be chaos and bedlam. I have 30 plus years of experience, after all. You know, I have the confidence and the experiences to draw on that I'm rarely caught flat-footed by anything that happens in a game. When you start out, you won't have that necessarily. Hopefully you'll have the confidence, but even if you don't, there's still ways of making it all work. And now the important thing, of course, in game mastering is to remember you are a participant too. So it's important that you have fun as well as the players. But if everybody is having fun, and when you really look back and you see how the players are enjoying the world you're creating and the experiences that you're bringing to them, hopefully you'll get a good sense of pride and satisfaction out of it. I know I do whenever I have a good game. So, and even when I have a bad game, it's not up to what I usually consider to be my standards. I learn from it, and I try to make sure the next time is better. And my players trust that I will keep working on my craft. Nobody is the absolute greatest they could ever be. Everybody can improve somehow. So, I'm going to, first of all, do this video for people who are going to be playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, because that's what I get the most questions about, quite honestly. If you are having a hard time attracting players, the most popular game in the world is the one that's easiest to find people for. And quite honestly, it's a simple fact. 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons is the most popular game out there, with more players playing it online and in, face-to-face than any other game. So I'm going to be making this generally about role-playing games overall, but a lot of what I say is going to hold true to Dungeons & Dragons primarily, and that's the examples that I'm going to be using. Now, if you don't have the core resources, you're starting from scratch, well, the avenue that I would recommend, especially if your players are also starting from scratch, is to go out and sample. Don't necessarily, go whole hog and, spend $150 on core source books. That's oftentimes going to lead to problems and difficulties. Better yet, pool your money together with your players, because they're participating. They should pay for it too, unless, of course, you are going to own everything afterwards, as I often do. But what I would recommend is starting off simple, something like a starter set. Now, the starter set has everything that you need to start running a game, to run a game for a number of players, and it gives you lots of help and advice along the way on how the game runs. This can be invaluable when you are starting out for the very first time. And even if you have access to the other tools, this starting adventure is challenging, but it has lots of tips and tricks on how to run the game so that you, as a first-time game master, can feel like somebody is walking you through and showing you all of the different details to running games successfully. So, something like this can be really, really ideal. if you have never played before, and if you don't have any of the books, this is ideal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it has a quick primer of the basic rules. These are also available for free online at Wizards' website, wizards.com, but having it in hand to be able to reference can be awfully handy. That is also, unfortunately, one of my great regrets for this starter set, is that I loaned it to somebody so that they could peruse away from the table, and they never brought it back. So this is a neutered set, I'm afraid. So I can't really show you the basic set, but it was a pamphlet of 25 double-sided pages, about 50 pages in all, that showed you the basics on how to play the game. It talked about the very simple mechanics for success and failure. Rolling a 20-sided die, adding any numbers that you had to add to it, and comparing it against a target number, whether it be an armor class, a difficulty check, whatever. And it would show you and break down the different times that you would roll, how you would roll, what you would need to add, and on a fairly consistent basis, because Dungeons & Dragons is a codified and consistent set of rules. Once you understood that, you could understand basically how to play the game. Everything else is just filling in the numbers. It has 6 pre-generated characters, so that your group can have a sampling of some of the core characters of the game. The characters that came with it were a fighter, a second fighter, because you can never have too many fighters. You're going to notice something very quickly if you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons before, but we'll get to that. You had another fighter. Oh, I see. I printed out several of these, so no, never mind. You had a fighter, a cleric, a rogue, a wizard, and I think there were 2 fighters, and 2 clerics, perhaps? At any rate, there are 6 characters. Yeah, I reprinted out several of the fighters for my own use. But they had 2 different types. They had one who used dexterity and ranged weapons primarily, and then you had one who was about defense and sword and shield. So you had a little bit of a range. All 4 of the characters were one of the 4 pillars of the Dungeons & Dragons experience from ages past. Your fighter, standing in front and absorbing punishment for the rest of the group to survive. The cleric, who could heal and enhance the group. A rogue, who handles all those tricky little skills that the others just simply don't have the time to worry about, like finding traps and opening doors and things like that. And the wizard, the one who would have ultimately a strong effect of either controlling combat, doing mass damage, or having all those utility spells that helps the party get places where they otherwise couldn't. Those are the 4 pillars of the Dungeons & Dragons experience, and those are the classes that are featured in the basic set of rules. They also give the adventure path, or the career path for each of those, which is the most common and relatively simplest career path they could take. For the fighter, it's the champion, somebody who gets to be really good with their weapons and has critical hits more often, and abilities that allow them to stay in the fight. You had the Evoker Wizard, who has the biggest booms and explosions for mass damage. You had, I believe it was the Thief Rogue class. Again, somebody who specializes in all of those dungeoneering skills that come in handy. And I'm pretty sure the Cleric was the Cleric of Life, who will get extra healing, which is so essential in a game where you're going to take a lot of damage. Now, obviously, if you get the full set of rules, you have access to all of the different paths and far more classes. But this is enough to get you started on the path, all the information that you would need about taking these characters and running them through the first adventure, which is included with the book, The Lost Mines of Phandelver. This is how a lot of people get into 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, running through this adventure. Something kind of inspiring about that common bonding experience. But most people, if you mention something about the Lost Mines of Phandelver, they'll pretty much instantly know what you're talking about. I myself have played it. I have never run it, however. It was an interesting little game, I will say that. But, more to the point, it also comes with dice. I don't think the set came with miniatures. Pretty sure it didn't. No. But it did include several maps so that you would have something to lay out in front of your players. At least as far as what were in the module itself. So with this, you could run the game. And how would you prepare using a starter set like this? In many ways, very similarly to how you would do everything else. What I would recommend, and again, this is my technique, but it's fairly straightforward. Get a notebook. If you don't travel around, a full-size spiral notebook works fine for me. Actually, this is the notebook that I'm currently using for my Mighty Protectors campaign. Top-bound spiral. I kind of like it. It allows me to keep everything neat and orderly. But you want some sort of a notebook. Something to keep your notes on. And yes, I know, I'm old school, and some people are into the digital age, and they do all their things on their phone or whatever, but having access to something like this makes it so much easier to write down notes, keep track, and organize them as you're going. With a little bit of skill and a little bit of determination, you can fill this with all sorts of things that will help your game out tremendously. Tremendously. So, first thing you do, absolutely first thing, the Game Master should ideally be as savvy in the rules as anybody else. So the first thing I would recommend is reading through the rules. If you go through the basic rules that came with the starter set, and I am aware too that there is an essential set, which is essentially the same thing, it just has a different adventure. Pretty neat one from what I've heard, but I haven't played it yet. By reading the rules and understanding the rules, you get a sense of what Dungeons & Dragons is. If you've never played a role-playing game before, that can be really important because there's a lot of misconceptions about what role-playing games really are. Role-playing games are many things, and that's important to remember because your experience will not be the same as another group somewhere else. We have certain commonalities. Maybe it's using the same set of rules, but even then, some groups will have their own house rules and different ways that they interpret rules. What really comes down to it is that we're all in pursuit of having fun and generally playing, games which are sets of rules and guidelines. But if you, for instance, love storytelling and you really are more interested in telling an entertaining story where your players are living, breathing characters that come to life, talk in character through their players, and they value interplay with other non-player characters far more than the cut, thrust, and parry of combat, then you might be running a completely different game than a dungeon crawl, detail-driven group who really values their players' knowledge and allows that player knowledge to more directly influence the gameplay than just relying on dice rolls. More of an old-school approach, which can work in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons just as well as it can work in any other game. So, understanding the rules and understanding the game and what it offers is important. Going into a game blind and not thoroughly understanding the rules, especially as some of your players do, can mean you're going to be caught up by them and being brought up to speed by them during gameplay can be jarring. But understanding the core rules is important. And in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, it's really simple. Almost everything comes down to I roll a 20-sided die, I add the numbers that modify it, roll the die, add the numbers. Primarily, it's going to be based off one of your 6 attributes: strength, dexterity, constitution, wisdom, intelligence, or charisma. All of those numbers have a rating, and depending on how high or how low they are, they'll have either a bonus or a penalty, or maybe none. And whatever that is, you would add it to the die roll. And then if you have anything else, like a magical item, then you would add that to the die roll. It's almost always addition, very seldom subtraction. And finally, if you are particularly skilled at what you're trying to do, you will have something called a proficiency bonus, which slowly increases as your character goes up levels, showing how they improve through the course of their career. And again, in 5th edition, that's a relatively small number. So generally your numbers are almost always going to be 30 or lower. It's not generally hard math, which is one of the attractions of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, quite honestly. So, once you understand that premise, everything else flows from that. You're attacked by a dragon's breath. What do? You roll a die and find out what happens. If you're going to attack someone, what do? You roll a die, find out what happens. If you're trying to climb up a wall, what do? You roll a die and figure out what happens. The art of all of that is figuring out when to roll dice and when not to. Is what you're doing or what the player's wanting to do just a mindless hassle that they'll eventually do given time, and the time really doesn't matter? Don't make them roll. If they have to scale up a wall to get into a higher corridor, don't make them roll it out unless there's really some consequence for failure. And if that's the case, let them fail once and then still succeed. Don't let them keep rolling and rolling and rolling to try to make that athletics check to climb up the wall. It's really annoying and really time-consuming, and that is a style of gameplay. That's my approach. Now, you might be a simulationist where you like to, okay, if you're going to climb up that, you're going to have to climb up that, or you're going to have to figure out some other way of getting up. So if you climb up and you fail, dunk, you take a die of damage, ow. Then maybe somebody else who's better at climbing than you climbs up and they hand you down a rope. Now you don't have to roll because you just tie yourself to the rope and you can't really fail because they're holding you as you climb. That's a good way of getting around an obstacle, and thinking oftentimes beats dice rolling. It's a good guideline. You want to encourage your players to think as you're going along. Now once you understand the rules, and I'm not saying complete comprehension, you just need to know the general gist of what the game is all about. I mean, you might learn all of the rules, and sometimes that's ideal. And honestly, sometimes that can be what a notebook is useful for. Writing down notes about the critical things that you're going to need to know about the game. If you find a chart and there's a really useful reference in that chart, maybe you write it down so you don't have to open up the book and you can refer to it. Also, there's a tool called a Game Master screen or a Dungeon Master screen in Dungeons & Dragons, the inside of which is filled with all these charts and tables that are useful time and time again. An investment in that might not be a bad thing for a starting Game Master who just wants to have reminders of the critical rules that they're going to be using again and again. Also, it kind of looks cool. It usually has a nice picture for the players to see so they can, really get the feeling that they're in the game. And it allows you to roll secretly. But we'll talk about that in a later episode on how to Game Master. But we're talking about prep here. So understanding the rules and getting whatever kind of notes you need before you even talk your players through their first characters and so on and so forth. You want to kind of know what you're getting into. And with a starter set like this, they'll often give you enough to know so that you can start playing. Now, after you've done that, you've read through the basic rules, you understand the game. If they come with pre-generated characters and you're going to use the pre-generated characters, take a look at them real quick. And try to get in a sense why and how everything works. Looking at something like this might be intimidating if you've never read the basic rules, because there's a lot of stuff on here. And on the back, there's a lot of stuff on here. What does all of this mean? What is all of this going to do for me? Well, if you've read the rules, a lot of this stuff makes sense in the fact that they fill out all the details for you that normally the character would decide when they're creating a character. The only thing they don't really fill out is the name. That is the players to come up with. But character class, level, background, alignment, race, primary statistics, what skills they are proficient in, and what their current level of skill is. The numbers that they would basically use if they're going to try something related to that skill, they would roll a die and add that number. Very quick, very easy, one number, add to it, no math, besides one simple number addition. Saving throws, which are useful against a variety of different attacks, many of them magical, but not always. And some of those they are proficient in too, based on the class that they are. How many hit points they have, that's an important one to know. What their armor class is if they get into a fight, their initiative bonus, Their hit die, that's if they rest, they can recover some hit points by bandaging up and resting. Most of the damage in a game like Dungeons & Dragons is abstract. It's not really cuts and wounds. It's fatigue, exhaustion, sprains, and strains. And if you get a cut, it's not a lethal cut until it's your last few hit points. So being able to just take a breather and bandage up can get you up and fighting trim again fairly quickly. This is the genius of the starter set, though. They have all of the ideals, bonds, flaws, and personality traits already filled in for you. This character is already pre-programmed and ready to go into this adventure. These are all designed for the Lost Mines of Phandelver, so all of these are things that will tie the character into the story ready to go. That's something you don't have if you have the main book. It has a selection of different motivations, different goals, different flaws that are generally appropriate to that class. But, this is important, they're not specifically tied into the adventure you're running. This is actually a pretty good way to start. This obviates to a certain extent your need to have a session 0. A pre-game meeting where you make up your characters and discuss the game, the world, and anything the players will need so that they can hit the ground running when they get ready to play. This is all stuff that would normally be done during that time. So, very useful that it's here and now. Your character's special abilities, what they can do based on their race and their class. Their primary combat abilities based on the weapons that they have. That's already figured out for you. It's just simple, roll a die and add this number. It doesn't get any simpler than that, really. What your character's proficiencies in languages are, how much wealth they have, and the gear that they have to start out with. All nicely arranged. And on the back, they have a summary of all that it means for a first-time player to understand what does it mean to be human in a Dungeons & Dragons world, in a world of fantasy where there's elves and dwarves and orcs. What does being human really mean? We know what it means in our world, but it is different in a fantasy world. So, especially relative to the other races, the other what's the political structure for a human society generally like? Well, in this time period, it's mostly feudal, so you're going to have lords and nobles, and then you're going to have a peasant class, and in between you're going to have skills and trades. Adventurers kind of float in there somewhere, mostly in the middle class, since they're not tied to the land or bound too tightly under the edicts of their lord in many games. Fighter, what's your role? What are you doing as this character? And again, these are decisions that are decided for you with these pre-generated characters. In the case of this particular fighter, with his high strength, poor dexterity, and good constitution, this character uses a great axe and a javelin to combat his foes, and he has chainmail. No shield necessary if you're going to use a great axe. So he has a static armor class of 17, so he's tough to hit and hurt. And he has quite a few hit points, 12 starting out. So what's his job? To move up, menace enemies, deal crushing damage with his axe, and if he's lucky, avoid taking too much damage so that he can be healed or he can rest after a fight. So this describes what that philosophy in combat is. After that, it's using the traits that you're keyed into from the personality bits to roleplay, to give you the hints on what's important to your character, what do you want to get out of your adventuring life, and also hints at what makes it successful is in your outlook, what are the goals that you're trying to get to. So, the background, there's a little bit of information based on the world. Now again, this would often be covered in a session 0, but if you read this, you will know enough to hit the ground running starting into the Lost Mines of Phandelver. You know where you are, briefly, when you start the game. You'll know who... I don't know if it tells you stuff about the other characters. But these are tied into the world. This character is a human noble. His personal goals are to civilize Phandalin, the out there city on the frontier, sort of, that you start out in. And his goal is to make something of the city. Everything he does to protect the city and make it more attractive, help it to grow, helps his goals out, which is cool. And his alignment being lawful neutral, he's going to stick to that. He won't always do what's right for individual people, but he will stick to his goal with dogged determination and keep his word about what he's trying to do. Also important in this, they have a guideline on how to improve your character. Step by step, the improvements that you would make to your character following your adventure paths. And they make those decisions for you. So for instance, at second level at 300 experience, you get your action surge, which is really useful as a fighter, allowing you to get another action in. You can only do that once per between rests. Third level, you have your improved critical. Because you are a champion, you deal critical damage more often. Criticals are fun. And at fourth level, you get ability score improvement. It increases your strength to an 18 from the 16 it was at. Yes. Which increases the amount of damage you do, increases how often you hit with that great axe. It's investing in your character's combat ability. So you don't need to reference any other book with these pre-generated character sheets, which is about as complete as I've ever seen a pre-generated character sheet, I'll be honest. The ones I give out to players are almost never this complete. And these are already designed to work with the Game Master. And now there are some problems to pre-generated characters, though. Sometimes your players will go into it and go, I don't really like any of these characters. Then what do? Well, remember, everything on this is printed in ink, but can be rewritten relatively easily. So if you want to change some things around, feel free. It's really not that crushingly important that, for instance, if your character really wanted to have his intelligence of 11, he wanted his dexterity at an 11 and his intelligence be a 9, so he's just kind of dumb, but he's not clumsy. That's fine. That's not a major impact to the character and can actually influence the game in a fun way. Sometimes having a guy who makes mental mistakes makes the game a little bit richer, because you can stumble into things or cause conflicts where there otherwise might not have been, or crises. Different stressors on the character. Okay, so once you understand the characters and understand their role and how they work, by the way, those of you who have more experience in the games, this is genius right here. Giving the players enough knowledge that they can have ready to go bonds, flaws, character traits that fit your world. So useful. Such a good idea. You can learn a lot from all sorts of materials, and even if you think you're above these starter sets, that's a brilliant idea. If the players have that much information going forward and you're aware of that information, that allows you to put in lots of hooks, lots of things that you can help the characters to get into the story with. Then, the module. Go ahead and read it. If you're going to run a game for other people using material you haven't written, you owe it to all of them to read through the material before you play it. Don't wing it. If you're going to truly run something like this, give it the credit it's due and read it. Cover to cover. Obviously focus on the beginning, how to set up your game. This starter set has a lot of useful information on how to do that. The first 2 pages are about running the adventure, what you as a game master need to do. This is beyond just being a dungeon master. This is good stuff for running any game in any campaign. Read through what's going to happen. Understand the events that are going to unfold, because you need to make that live and breathe for your players. And if you don't, if you ever open up a page and, oh, that's a surprise, there's going to be something. You might be able to improvise your way out of it, but still, that might have been something that might have had a lot greater impact if you knew it was coming beforehand. Especially if it's something that credibly could have been impacted by the events that took place before. And yes, I'm talking from experience here. I have thought that I could wing through something and made those kind of mistakes myself. So I'm speaking from experience here. There's a glossary which is useful for beginning game masters as well, so that you understand the verbiage that's used in the game, verbiage, and also a brief touch on the monsters, how they're run, what to do with a true monster, something that is not thinking, that just wants to hurt people, versus playing an intelligent enemy who doesn't want to get hurt but may be interested in hurting your characters. Are there ways around it? Are there other solutions rather than wiping out your enemies to a man or woman? So yes, then there's the background, the overview of the story. If you don't understand the overview of the story, you can cause all kinds of complications for yourself too. And yes, again, speaking from experience here, if you don't understand it, you can really give yourself some hassles. So make sure you understand, you're completely confident with where the events lead to, what they want if the story runs flawlessly. At the very least, understand that. It's also a good idea to understand, too, that sometimes if you are playing in a game where you are not railroading the players, you're allowing them to make choices, sometimes they will make choices that are not optimal for your story. Just get ready for that. It may happen to you. I'm not going to say it will, but it might, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, then you have your adventure hook. What brings the characters there? Now, we already have a lot of those hooks in place with the characters' backgrounds. They're already pre-programmed to get ready to go on this adventure. All of them want to do it for their own reasons. And that coming together with the different reasons creates interesting character interplay. For example, you have your character who wants to civilize Phandalin. So anything that's going to bring wealth into the town, anything that will stop the instability of the town, he's up for. Whereas somebody else might have a more human interest in the employer of the characters, and Phandalin can go swing in the wind as far as they're concerned. The one character might really want to do one thing, the other character might want to do something else, and they have to come together in order to make their goals come to life. They're stronger as a group than they are individually, after all. So ultimately you want that kind of cooperation. You want that kind of interplay. That makes interesting characters, not just mindlessly going through the adventure because that's what they're supposed to do. Another advantage to the adventure path system. They give a map, of course, of the area. Maps are useful. And this is a nice map, fills up a page. You can show your players off of this without having to photocopy anything else. Then they give your first encounter. Relatively early on, you start off the game with a fight. And what happens? You give 2 pages on how to run this opening encounter so that your players don't have to worry about the hassle of, do we negotiate? Should we start talking? Nope. Right into action. You don't have any choice. You got to defend yourself. So you get to use all those fun combat abilities and weapons and things you start out with, and boom, there's an enemy in front of you right off the bat. Great. It's a good way to start players off. You know, they can be really wondering what's going on, but the moment you turn this into, okay, it's a real fight, all of a sudden, now the players have something to really get their teeth into. There is a map, but this is not a full-blown map you can put your characters on, which is unfortunate. Some starting sets have all the maps that you're ideally going to use. What do you do if you don't have that resource? There's a couple of options. One is to actually have some sort of an erasable mat, like a battle mat. I have a couple. They're handy. They're actually pretty ideal for that kind of an encounter. But are they ultimately necessary? Not really. You could just use scratch paper, or you can use your notebook. Write down the information, write down where people are, maybe do a thumbnail sketch so the players have some idea of what's going on. But you want to know how this combat is going to be run, the starting point for the characters and everything like that. Note that I'm talking about the read-through at this point. I'm not talking about actually running the game, because there's more to put on this before that happens. But you want to understand how this unfolds, and this will probably be your first taste of combat, both as a game master and as a player. So, as a game master, you have to understand, where are the dangers? Where are the players likely to have problems? In this case, it could be being attacked by archers. If they can't respond in kind, they're going to have a long fight of it. They could take damage that might incapacitate several of the characters if they're not careful. So working together, hopefully they're going to be able to deal with those situations. But as a game master, understanding the motivations of the monsters and the enemies of your players is often just as important. For example, in that first fight, the characters that they're facing are weak monsters. They are not bloodthirsty killers. Well, no, they are killers, and they would very much like to spill the player's blood. But if they throw a credible defense against them, or if they just find they can't hit one character because they're too well protected, they could easily break and flee. They may not want any of what the players are willing to give back. And that's important to think about too. You have to consider those kind of positions as a game master. Not all enemies will fight to the death. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of them don't want to die. So if the fight goes against them, if they take too many wounds, they'll turn around and run more often than not. These creatures are simple. Yeah, they should run away fairly quickly. If the fight is starting to go against them, they start taking losses, they realize these guys are ready to fight back. So that's a lot of time I hear of people saying even that first encounter can be really deadly. And yes, if the dice go against you, that can be bad. But at the same time, a lot of times the first time game masters will push it as a fight to the death scenario, and it never has to be like that. Considering the perspective of all the characters is the game master's prerogative. And if you're going to make it feel real, then watching little creatures running away going, "Oh, run, flee, they're too strong," makes the players feel awesome. Makes them feel like their characters are tough and cool, even if they're first level and could probably be taken down by a single arrow. So that's a good thing to note as you go through. And now after you get through that first combat encounter, you can keep looking through the little mini dungeon and the different encounters that are available there. Then look at another scenario where they can actually have a role-playing encounter with somebody. Think about the personality of the people. It's all outlaid for you in the adventure. But think from that person's perspective. What kind of a voice might you use to indicate that you're talking with somebody else's voice? If you're talking, on behalf of the rather gruff dwarf who hires the characters out, whatever. He's a dwarf, and he's a working man's dwarf, so he's kind of crude and craggy. You might want to come up with a voice for him. It doesn't have to be an accent. You don't have to do anything silly. You just it really helps if you come up with some way of letting players know you're not talking as the dungeon master, you're talking in character. And if that means giving someone a voice, that could be what it means. If you're good with accents, you might try using an accent, but it's not required, and it's kind of more of an advanced thing if you really want to do it. Practice a bit, and before you know it, you'll be talking in character when you're talking in character. And just going through the book, step by step by step by step by step, understanding the encounters. Maybe doing an outline on here can be useful. If I was going to do that, all the times not to have a pencil, right? Haha. I will pull out one of these fancy Dungeons and Dragons pencils. Oops. That I got from starter kits back in the day. 3rd edition starter kits had little D&D pencils. I've got like 6 of them. But if I was doing this and I was looking through, I would be making the following notes like a flowchart. I got one with a broken pencil. Figures. Try again. I gotta sharpen that one. Little nubs. Okay, so I would write at the top the first encounter that I have, and quite honestly, even if you're not doing the Lost Mines of Phandelver, starting out your very first encounter with a fight is a great way to throw your players into the fire and get them all interested in figuring out how to work together. Ultimately, over the course of several adventures, your players will learn how to synergize with each other, hopefully. They will learn who can fight by their own for a little bit, who needs protection from enemies, how having somebody else doing Overwatch over the whole battle can be handy. Maybe how to work with other people to maximize your own damage. Depends on what you're playing and your styles and everything. But generally, everybody's going to have something that they do well. And figuring out what everyone else does well and how to let them do it as best as they can in a given fight is often the key to success or versus failure. So starting off the fight oftentimes can expose that, hey, we don't work so well together yet. We need to work on this. And let the people who are really good at something kind of show, hey, I am really good at this. So you want to rely on me being able to crush people with this great axe as often as possible, perhaps. It gives you a good sales pitch for the way that you want to fight. And then later on, the group can kind of work around that. So then, if you have branching paths from this point, for example, if they survive that fight and they want to go straight to the town of Phandalin, you can write a little note, little box there. But if they don't, they want to go chase after where the goblins came from in the opening goblin fight. Branching adventure path there. And note that if they don't choose that particular path, they might be able to come back to it and later on challenge that once they feel like they're more secure, once they aren't as beat up, etc., etc., etc. So these are the very first steps of getting ready to run a particular adventure. And by understanding the flow of the adventure, by the time I was done, this would be completely full with all different options and paths and encounters that the players would have. I could write notes on this too, and I can write notes as the adventure kind of lays out as well, based on what did they do. Once they get through an encounter, I can scratch that off, or I can write on a note, what did this mean? Did they run away? Are these enemies still alive? I can make a note of that. What will happen to them? And then I can write notes through my notebook as to what happens to those people who aren't killed. But has their opinion changed? Are their views going up, down, whatever? So I can do this through the entire storyline. So having a notebook handy while you're going through the adventure is handy to have. Also, at certain points, you should also kind of have a sense for how you want to show certain things. For instance, if you drop a goblin and he's got a magical +1 axe, that is, if you haven't played Dungeons & Dragons before, it's an axe that when you hit, you add +1 to your rolls, so it gives you a better chance of striking. And if you do damage, it gives you an extra +1 point of damage, so it hurts harder, hurts more. But do you as a game master want to say, well, the goblin is dead, you check him over, and in his hand he's holding a +1 axe. Number one, did he use it in that fight? You should remember that, so he can do the extra damage. The goblin should get the benefit of the weapon too, which can sometimes make finding an item a little more painful. But, more to the point, when they find the axe, do you want to say, well, he was holding a +1 axe? No mystery to it. People can recognize a magical axe when they see it. For some game masters, this works fine. For others, well, you see that he has a strange axe. It's a fairly common style of hand axe, but it definitely looks elven. It's got a very graceful arch to it. The head is relatively small, but very fine and very keen. And it's really hard to put an estimate on how old it is. It's so finely made. You didn't tell them that it's magical, but you told them it was exceptional, and they'd be fools to not think about picking it up and taking them with them. In that way, in a more narrative approach, you don't give everything away, you make them work for it. Maybe one of them has heard about this style of axe that's well known by elven woodsmen to be used to fell their foes and keep them alive out in the woods. So, yeah, they can figure out, yeah, it's probably magical. And if so, it's probably a not terribly powerful weapon, but one that's reliable and enchanted to be just that little bit more effective for the elves. And therefore, by having it, you have a little bit nicer weapon. So, that's all something that you develop as your style, game masters. And starting at this point, when you first uncork an adventure, a lot of times will determine how smooth it seems when the players are rolling bodies and triumph. Do you just tell them what they want to know, or do you let them work for it a little bit? Now, this group doesn't have a bard. They don't have a dedicated wheelhouse of information, but the wizard's pretty smart. He might be able to figure out with an arcana check, a roll to see what you know about all things magical, and he might recognize the glint of magic in it. I always give wizards a little bit of an advantage in that they can sense magic inherently to some extent. The same goes with sorcerers, but those who get the power from outside, like warlocks, not as much generally until they get more powerful. So that's just a slight little thing that I do, but that you don't have to. If that doesn't work for you, don't do it. So by thinking about those things as you're going through a module for the very first time, this prepares you so when you get to that point, you can smoothly transition from one step to the next, and you can be ready for whatever is going to happen. And remember, your game, if you want your game to be a dynamic world where it's not just one isolated encounter as opposed to another, the events of combat are generally a lot of noise, screams of pain, cries of triumph, clanging of metal. They're noisy affairs. They often will draw attention. So it may be that you get through a battle, you're going to let other people know that there was a battle. And depending on the nature, if there are monsters present, they might go and check. There might be a free meal there, or there might be treasure there if they value treasure. So bear that in mind when you're running these games. And a lot of times these starter sets will talk about it, but only if you read ahead and you understand how these events are related. For instance, if the creatures from the goblin lair were close enough that they could hear the fight with the goblins, you might draw a line back, and I would write on battle. See what I did there? I just wrote that note saying that in a battle, the folks from here are going to know about what's going on in that encounter, and therefore will either be ready for a fight themselves, that they're going to reinforce, they're going to have spears ready to throw, for instance, or maybe some crude trap set up, or nets ready to cast, something. Or are they far enough away that they can be caught unawares after this battle? Maybe. Maybe not. That's up for the Game Master to decide, and that's why we read through these things in advance, so that the world feels seamless as it should, if the world is living and breathing as you can make it unfold for your players. So, eventually, you read the whole thing out. The thing generally reads a bit like a story. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is relatively humble. There are encounters, there are combats that are peaks, there are crises that are resolved after the combat, for better or for worse, and then you move on from that point to the next. In situations like dungeon crawling, there can be lots and lots and lots of peaks. But they generally have a rise, a conclusion, and then an end. Role-playing's much the same way. You meet a new person, tensions start to rise as you wonder who this person is, what impact they're going to have on your story, and if they'll like you. Then you can role-play it out. Some people prefer to role-play first and then role-play. Some people don't feel comfortable talking in character, which is fine. It's not for everybody, and that's true. And for those people, they like to resolve things with a single die roll. And if their character is really good at talking, that sometimes can help. But if somebody makes a character that's really good at talking, and they themselves don't feel good at talking, you should probably consider not punishing them if they personally misspeak where their character would be more eloquent. Because they built that with that in mind oftentimes. So, understanding the adventure, critical to your very first run. Now, if you're doing an adventure path, say Princes of the Apocalypse, which I have run, again, reading it end to end allows you to understand how elements work, how the balances and everything are going to shape up, and how the events are going to unfold. The situation will change and get more drastic as the players move on. There is an elevation that goes throughout the game that matches the elevated power the players get to. Rarely is it probably going to feel overwhelming until the crescendo of it, and then it's testing to see how far you've come. But overall, there's a lot of moving parts in something like this. Lost Mines of Phandelver is much simpler. Not a lot of moving parts. There's mysteries to uncover? Yes. There's combats that can sort out some of them? Sure. There's places to explore and wonders to find? Absolutely. But as far as the overall how one could prepare for something like that, it's the same thing. You read the whole thing, and to understand it, you kind of plan out how these different encounters might go. The major difference in something like this is that there are several side quests and different paths the players can explore. This works really well if your players are inquisitive and they want to go out and find different leads that can lead to a more complete story. If your players aren't so inquisitive, then a lot of the stuff in here might not really ever be used, but it's there in case they stumble upon it. And if you're a game master who kind of wants some of this extra stuff to show out, every once in a while you can have them stumble onto something, a map or an NPC who tells them they want something from someplace or something like that. But that's all advanced game mastery, and we're talking about getting your first adventure prepped. So that is how you generally start to get ready to run your very first adventure experience into 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Join me for the next session where I'll actually go into getting everything prepped and finally opening up with your session 0 and the first steps of your game. Thank you for joining me. I am OmnusI, and I'll see you the next time we're crawling through the dungeon. Farewell.